Well, good morning, everybody, to the first event that we at HEPI, the Higher Education Policy Institute, are putting on in 2025. And this is jointly organised with our partners, long-standing partners, Advance HE. And in a moment, I'll hand over to Alison Johns, the CEO of Advance HE, with whom we conduct a huge amount of work, including our flagship student academic experience survey, which I'm sure will come up in the conversation today. As I say, this is the first in a series of 3 events. We're doing 2 other events in the spring with Advance HE, though those are in-person events. So have a look at our website to see if you're available to come to those. This morning's one, however, is on the topic of earning and learning. What's the reality for today's students? We've got 3 fantastic speakers from very diverse backgrounds that Alison will introduce just in a moment. So my only job really is to welcome you here on behalf of HEPI, which, for those of you who don't know, is an Oxford-based think tank. I'm sure you do know because you're here. But have a look at our website if you'd like to know more about us and our work. And so, with no further ado, I'm going to pass over to Alison Johns, CEO of Advance HE, who will chair the rest of the seminar.
Thank you very much, Nick, and good morning, everybody, and a very warm welcome to this, as Nick said, our first joint seminar. And we're absolutely delighted to be hosting this breakfast seminar series with HEPI. I think it's become something of a familiar feature in the sector calendar, and we have a great partnership with HEPI, and we really enjoy working with them. So today, we're going to be examining a crucial transformation in higher education: the increasingly intricate relationship between earning and learning. I do remember from my HEFCE days when we had questions about how could students possibly earn and work and do a full-time degree. My goodness, look at how things have changed. As Nick said, I will mention our student academic experience survey, which we do with HEPI, because the latest one reveals now that over half of full-time undergraduates work during term time. And that's a striking statistic, I think, which really demands our attention as sector leaders. And if we want to look at the figures, it's 56% of students. And if you look at those students who are working, they're now working an average of 14.5 hours a week. You know, that's potentially equivalent to timetable classes or independent study. And if we drill down a little bit deeper, we can see that employed students are more likely to have more contact hours, spend time commuting and or caring for others. And we also see that they predominantly come from care experience backgrounds, or interestingly, Northern Ireland, and perhaps less surprisingly, Greater London. And we think that this shift really raises some fundamental questions about how we deliver education. We know that many institutions are already adapting and reorganizing timetables and supporting student employment. And meanwhile, we're seeing much greater growth in integrated approaches like degree apprenticeships and employer co-designed courses. And of course, the Lifelong Learning Entitlement promises to reshape completely how people engage with higher education throughout their careers. And as Nick said, we've got a great panel of speakers today who are going to help us explore whether these changes actually reflect positive developments in employer and student demands, or if they're primarily driven by financial pressures. Most importantly, we will be considering the implications for institutional leadership and policy making as we adapt to this new reality. I'm delighted to introduce our speakers today: Amira Campbell, President of the National Union of Students; Professor Steve Decent, Principal and Vice-Chancellor of Glasgow Caledonian University, and also an Advance HE board member; and Ashley Wheaton, Vice-Chancellor, University College State Management, UCEM. Can I just remind you that everything we say in our online seminars is on the record, because the whole session is recorded and then shared later. Each speaker will have the usual 7 minutes, and once they've completed their slots, we'll begin the Q&A. Between Emma and I, we'll organise it so that we ask 3 questions at a time, but Emma will open the microphones for the questioners so that you can ask your questions of the panel. We think that way will give them some time to consider and join up some of, I'm sure, the very interconnected issues that will arise. So if there are no questions further, I don't think so. We will begin. One thing I should say is, for some reason, yesterday I had terrible Wi-Fi, and should that happen, if I lose it, Nick will seamlessly step in and I will return, I promise you. So fingers crossed for good connections in every sense of the word today. So can I begin, please, by inviting Amira, President of the NUS, to begin the panel presentations. Thank you. Welcome, Amira.
Thank you, Alison, and thank you, HEPI and Advance HE, for having me here today. So I'm going to sort of go through some of the experience stuff that many of you will already know about, get into a little bit about the things that we can actually do, the positive and practical changes that we can make, and then get into the sort of conversation about the model, why we hold on to what we want to be changed and how we can begin to adapt. And it may be a bit of a frustrating lesson, but I do promise that by the end, we'll have really got somewhere with what we're trying to say. So many will already know that approximately 69% of students are doing some level of part-time work alongside their studies, which is obviously a very significant majority, and for a lot of our home students, this is often driven by a necessity as opposed to choice, driven by rising costs of living, the burden of student loans, while jobs provide a source of income for many students, it does often come along with long hours, low wages, and this can lead to further stress, exhaustion, etc., alongside studies. We also know for a lot of international students that these same realities can be even more daunting. Not only have we got students adapting to new academic environments, different cultures, language barriers, etc., socially, we also have sort of the impetus of visa regulations, which impose strict work limits, which can often push people into low-paying or low labor-intensive jobs that barely cover people's expenses. And so why in the same sense, we have many people going into work that is exciting, work that uplifts their university experience. We do see that the majority of those are doing it for financial reasons and because of the financial burden that many students are experiencing. But there's actually quite a lot that we can do, and some universities are already doing so much. Some universities have become mass employers of students themselves, placing them on part-time contracts alongside their studies, often paying better than neighbouring organisations around them. I will note that some of you have been more nervous about legitimising work alongside studies, and sometimes that can actually cause more harm. We've seen universities limiting the hours beyond the legal limits. What I mean by this is obviously there's a 20-hour working cap for our international students, and we see a lot of universities not cap work at around that same place, making it very difficult for them to fill out the rest of the hours that they legally can do in other employers with other employers. Then, we also have the challenges of how much universities pay, and something that's quite interesting is sometimes universities pay their students better than their lowest paid staff, which is obviously very concerning and something that we need to try to change. But what I can reassure you as someone who used to be an SU leader at the University of Birmingham Guild of Students literally last year was that we got that changed to 20 hours. So there is a big Russell group for anyone who needs that to prove a point within the place that they are working. And then some of you, like De Montfort, have shifted the way that you teach, shifted the way that the term looks like to potentially offer more chances for students to work during other times outside of study. Some of you are looking at how you can introduce compulsory extracurricular components into studies, integrating it in that space, as opposed to the expectation that extracurricular would be in the time that people need to be doing work for. Some of you have student unions who are paying student leaders. I myself was running a Black student campaign during my time at Birmingham, and I was remunerated for that work. I was paid as part of the democratic and the political work that I was doing. Some of us can do things as ourselves in our own communities. We can be part of that national campaigning at an actually very local level. Asking for that working cap to be raised, pushing for apprentices to be paid a living wage, urging for the abolition of age-tiered minimum wage bans, constantly pushing, sending emails to MPs, talking to community groups, working with organisations like Citizens UK and the Living Wage Foundation, and talking about the challenges that students are facing. And then some of you are already in that space talking about people's workers' rights. Some of you are part of your UCU or Unison or Unite, you're active trade union members, you're active community members trying to push for the rights of the peers that you see. Some of you are that direct support to students in well-being departments, talking to them, finding them access to hardship funds and bursaries. So in many senses, it's not that we aren't actively all doing things in the current circumstances where we see more and more people working due to the financial burden that students face. But I guess what we're stuck at is that it feels that we're constantly doing all of this work to alleviate the challenges that people are facing in a system and a model that isn't serving them completely. And so this is the space where we want to be more innovative with that model. We're going to think about different ways that we could make our model work with the realities of how many have to work now alongside studies. And in our sector, it strikes me that we love models and that they have served us really well for a really, really long time. We legitimized the model that, generally speaking, held young people in full-time study, not strictly 9 to 5, but definitely full-time, for 3 years in a learning environment that prioritized critical thinking, a sort of, I guess, gated community that established normalizing the idea that not only were they learners, but they were also sports persons and politicians for the community. They were artists and debaters, they were volunteers and activists and aggravators, and all of those things were encompassed within the university experience. They were all part of that full-time study experience. And then, ideally, fingers crossed, they would take that practice and those principles into the working world. And now there is both exciting and not so exciting parts about how our sector is shifting. We have more mature learners, an impetus on lifelong learners. We have more people who have already held lots of experience in the working world in our spaces. But as said earlier, we also have many who are financially struggling, much greater than they ever have been. Before doing this talk, I was struck by something that I read actually in a book yesterday, and it's a book by Jane McCavity. It's called No Shortcuts, and it was actually a book that one of my close mentors at the student union at Birmingham had recommended to me. And in it, when she is talking about workers and unions and all sorts, and I recommend it to obviously anyone who gets excited about words like advocacy, mobilizing, and organizing. But McCavity sees democracy and unions as inseparable, right? We all know the old phrase of sort of democracy is the best system that we've got, right? And inseparably for McCavity, unions are the best way to ensure the rights for working class citizens, right? So McCavity workers, the masses, etc. We have natural leaders on whom we all rely: nurses, teachers, school bus drivers, congregants, voters. And the more that we get to know all of them, the more power we all hold in making change. So get to know your students, because in this case, they are the masses. But if we know them really, really well, then we can begin to make the changes that we need to for everyone.
Thank you, Amira. That's a really great note to end on. And thank you for reminding us about how much we love models, but they are in our control. Thank you. If we could move on now to the next speaker, please. And it's Professor Steve Decent. Over to you, Steve.
Thank you, Alison. Thanks. Hi. So good morning, everyone. So I'm Steve Decent. I'm Vice Chancellor of Glasgow Caledonian University. So thanks to everyone for joining today, and thanks for having me here on this panel. So in my short scene setting, what I want to try to do is to cover this topic from a Scottish perspective, but then also use some examples from my own institution in trying to explain what we're trying to do. So the Scottish Government recently published a report in December where information on the financial experiences of students in further and higher education in Scotland were collected. Now, there were over 2,400 students who participated in this survey across 16 colleges and 16 universities. My own university, Glasgow Caledonian, was included in that. Now, the report found a high level of financial challenge for students across Scotland and consequent stress as a result for our student base. Now, there are some things which are a bit different in higher education in Scotland. The Scottish Government pays tuition fees for most Scottish students with an approach, I believe quite rightly, from the Scottish Government that studying should not be based on the ability to pay, but based on the ability to learn. Also, most undergraduate degree programs in Scotland are 4 years long. However, even those students who have their tuition fee paid by government can still leave their studies in debt. Even those students who receive more substantial bursaries, such as care experience students or nursing students in Scotland, can still find the level of financial support for them is inadequate for their needs. So, very much as Amira says, so many students then turn to part-time work to make ends meet to complete their studies. So this data from the Scottish Government report found that in Scotland, 76% of undergraduates and 83% of postgraduates were in some form of paid employment. Now, a small amount, I think, of part-time work can be helpful for some students to gain experiences and confidence. However, the report showed that the median number of hours worked by students across Scotland exceeds the weekly maximum recommended limit from most Scottish agencies of sort of 10 to 15 hours per week. So the impact of these financial troubles is clear to the sector. This part-time work interferes with students' ability to engage with their studies. The report showed that between half and 2/3 of all students reported that financial difficulties had affected their studies. And when looking at reasons for withdrawing from their courses, two of the most frequently reported reasons for students who had withdrawn was the difficulty of balancing paid work and study and not having enough money. So anticipating these challenges, the Scottish Government announced the provision of increased financial support for students from the start of this academic year. New special support loans have increased the available financial support to Scottish students to £11,400 for undergraduate students who come from households where the household income is less than £21,000. And also the care experience student bursary also increased to the same level. Whilst these increases are very, very welcome to our students, some students still report to us that the amount of support that they have is inadequate and they need to work part-time in addition. So I'll now talk a little bit about my own university, Glasgow Caledonian. So we're the largest recruiter of Scottish undergraduate students amongst all universities in Scotland. We're also the largest recruiter of widening access students in Scotland. So this academic year, we welcomed over 1,250 new students from the 20% most deprived postcodes in Scotland, and that was 26% of our intake. Over 1,000 of our undergraduate entrants declare a disability, 715 were in receipt of free school meals, over 100 were care experienced, and over 150 were estranged from their families. We also welcomed many hundreds of students who themselves have parental or caring responsibilities, and we're incredibly proud of our wonderful and diverse students. Many of our students live in the Glasgow area and commute from home. 70% of our undergraduate students are from Glasgow. We offer the most affordable student accommodation in Glasgow, and we work really hard to try to keep our rent costs down to support our students for those who need or for those who want to live away from home. So not surprisingly, we've seen increases in students reporting financial hardship, and paid employment is necessary for many students to continue their studies. Combining studies and part-time paid work is the reality, and we need to try to organise our education in a way to best support our students. At Glasgow Caledonian, with scholarships, and we've got hardship funds to try to help. We advertised over 200 on-campus paid employment opportunities for our students last year. We try to organise our timetables to help students access part-time work, and our wonderful staff work really hard to support our students, recognising their different needs. Glasgow Caledonian is currently the leading modern university in Scotland for graduate employment. In part, we can attribute this to the very large number of students who complete a work placement as part of their course, and we plan to expand this to try to get to the point where we ensure that all of our students on all of our courses have the opportunity for skilled work experience, but also to continue to work with professional bodies to maintain our very high number of courses with professional accreditation. Our delivery of education, I think, also needs to continue to shift. So Glasgow Caledonian is now the largest recruiter of graduate apprenticeship students in Scotland, and these are the Scottish equivalent of degree apprenticeships in England, where students work in a job which is relevant to their degree and complete their degree by blending their studies and their work at the same time. So we've got over 1,000 graduate apprenticeship students currently studying with us at Glasgow Caledonian, and this method of study is becoming increasingly popular with our students. These routes allow students to earn while they learn and earn on a topic which is relevant to what they want to do with the rest of their lives, and provides flexibility for learners as well as support for employers. There's also huge benefit in universities working closely with their student unions. We've got a really great relationship with the president of our Students' Association, which helps us to be responsive to the needs of our students. One example of our work is where we've supported our Students' Association to set up a student pantry, providing food for students who are struggling. Also, in our first term of this academic year, our Students' Association ran a scheme called Winter Warmers, where students could come along at a certain time and receive a free hot drink and a bowl of porridge. Combining studies and part-time paid work is the reality for most students, and as educators, it's our duty to help them navigate this. Universities must look at how we can support our students as being a central part of our approach to providing education. Universities and student unions benefit by working together to ensure our students are heard and that we provide the support that they need. Government also needs to continue to look at the bursaries and loans available to students. None of this is easy. Finally, education has never been more important. Our students greatly benefit from the opportunities that our universities provide. Our public and private sectors need our university graduates for their future workforces. Fundamentally, I think this is what universities do. We provide the transformational opportunities for our students to give them the skills and the confidence to enable them to do what they want to do with the rest of their lives, thus tackling these challenges to ensure that our students are supported to succeed. I think is absolutely essential for the future of universities. Thanks, Alison. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Steve. That's great. And it's great to hear all the things that you're doing and we know other universities are doing to support their students. Interesting question here about, is it acceptable? And I'm sure that'll be a great one for debate a bit later on. And it's my pleasure, finally, last but not least, Ashley, to introduce you and let's hear your perspective on this really important issue. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Alison. Really interesting listening to both Amira and Stephen, and thanks to the team at HEPI for putting on this event. I'm going to give you, in some respects, a perspective perhaps from the other end of this conversation. As Vice Chancellor of the University College of Estate Management, I run what is effectively a single industry-focused university, and let me try and give you a little bit more insight into what we do in numbers, first of all, and then we'll talk about some of, I think, the advantages of an earn while you learn model, how we go about it, and then maybe what some of the issues and challenges are. So my institution is 106 years old, and currently we have around 4,000 students studying across 50-50 split of postgraduate and undergraduate programs. Perhaps most importantly, all of those programs are industry focused. They all carry professional industry body accreditation, and they all lead, therefore, directly onto careers and employment opportunities. But it doesn't stop there. We are also 100% digital in our provision, possibly the only university in the entire system that doesn't rely at all on face-to-face provision. Our students range in age from 18 all the way up, as you might imagine, into more mature students studying later in their careers, even all the way on to those rare students in their later years at 60 years plus. And perhaps here's the statistic that might alarm you or startle you the most. 97% of our students are already in full-time work. They come through a variety of different routes. Most of them are employer sponsored, and as I'm sure you might imagine, the vast majority of those come through the apprenticeship funded levy. So 65% of our students are degree apprentices of one form or another. About a further 10% are sponsored by industry and paid directly. The remainder, frankly, are mostly those from overseas who have different funding models in place. We have direct relationships with over 700 employers, And that relationship, of course, is key. And that effectively gives us national coverage across the whole country. Despite all of that, our B3 outcomes metrics and our national student survey results remain extremely competitive and comparable with our campus-based colleagues across the sector. And we are broadly the largest provider of programs to the built environment, bar none, across the higher education provider sector. So let's turn our attention to why that model works for our students. There are a number of key things, some of which you might have already assumed. First thing our students tell us is that the lack of student debt or the lack of fee debt is, in their words, an absolute no-brainer. You know, they can come on a degree route sponsored through the apprenticeship levy and not exit with the substantial student debt that they would have to if they funded that through the student loan company. The second, and perhaps the harder to quantify part, is career acceleration. This joined up route way through the apprenticeship standard of earning while you learn in a relevant setting and a relevant career provides really fantastic opportunities, both during that 4.5 to 5 year apprenticeship program, but also on. And we're already starting to see career acceleration for students that completed their apprenticeship perhaps 2 years ago, who are far in advance of where they might have been had they come through a slightly more traditional route of undergraduate full-time program first, followed by employment, followed by looking for chartered membership, because of course that remains the prize for many of our students at the end of their degree qualification, is going on to get their chartered membership of the relevant professional body. Arguably, it's also faster. It can take an apprentice as little, doesn't sound like a little, but as little as 4.5 years to go from the start of their degree all the way through to chartered status. And that's almost impossible to do if you go on the other route. And of course, they are earning throughout that period as well. And of course, it's great for firms. It allows them to recruit on the basis of their levy and on the commitment to work in tandem with that student. Because remember, this is not just a two-way relationship between the university and the apprentice. It's a three-way relationship involving deep commitment and regular interplay between the employer and the university and the student. It isn't perfect. Just to end on a few important points. The first thing, of course, is that the funding for degree apprenticeships remains and is now further away from the funding available for traditional routes at £27,000 at the top banding. That's now £1,600 based on the new fee levels, below the same equivalent for a degree only. It comes with all sorts of regulatory requirements to meet conditions with Ofsted and with the ESFA, as well as, of course, meeting the requirements of the OFS. Sometimes those regulatory worlds do not coincide and don't live easily together. There continue to be financial challenges with endpoint assessment holdover of 20% of the fee and the in arrears payment model. There are some fickle changes in views at the regulator about how part-time and therefore apprenticeship students should be classified within data and data returns. And we've seen year-on-year changes between full-time, part-time, part-time, full-time. Quite difficult as a provider to keep up with all of that. It means our access and participation plan is broadly guided by what our employers are doing in terms of the apprentices that they are employing, and arguably makes us one step slightly removed from that equation. And I suppose as we look ahead, it means we are eagerly awaiting the anticipated changes on the growth and skills levy. We know change is coming. The frustrating part, of course, is we don't know what that change is yet, nor do employers. And of course, we have to see how all of this fits together with the lifelong loan entitlement, which remains equally, I think, uncertain at this period of time. And just to finish off, one of the reasons why I think our model works in our industry, and of course we are effectively a monotechnic in that regard, serving a single industry, is because the demand for professionals in that sector remains incredibly high. The latest report from the Construction Industry Training Board tells us that we need an additional 25,000 new qualified professionals across the built environment every year for the next 5 years if we're to meet the demands of the built environment. And by the way, that was before the current government committed to its ambitious home building agenda alongside all of the other construction and built environment imperatives. So there is a need for the professions. There is a great model that works really well with an earn while you learn apprenticeship and sponsored student model. And we see very successful outcomes from that. So if you like, that's a slightly different view from the end of the university sector in earning while you learn. So shall I hand back now to Alison if you're still there?
I am still here, and thank you very much for that, Ashley. That's fantastic. Well, there's a model that clearly works. So, and it's been around for a long time, Ashley. Thank you very much for that. What I'm going to do now is to ask the panel to put their cameras and their microphones back on. And we're now going to look at the questions. And thank you very much. Great questions coming in. What I'm going to do is obviously go to the ones with the most upvotes. But unfortunately for me, they're not in order, so I'm going to scroll through them. So I'm putting on notice Jonathan Neves, Susan Doherty, and Mary Cook. Those have got the most upvotes at the moment. Emma, can I invite you, please, to switch on and off the microphones of those people, and then we'll take another batch. Thank you. So we're going to start with Jonathan.
Hi, Alison. Can you hear me?
We can, thank you. We
Hi.
can't see you. That might be intentional, but we can't see you.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm not sure if that's
Not to worry.
Yeah, don't worry about that, but I'll crack on anyway. Good morning, everyone. Jonathan Neese from Advanced HE. I've also worked with HEPI on the student academic experience, so it's been talked about this morning. But one thing I wanted to ask about is we know from some of our research, some of our UK engagement research, that students often look to extracurricular activity to gain some of their wider skills. Now, we know so many students in paid employment, many of their extracurricular activity is in paid employment. Now, possibly more than before. So how can HEI support students in maximising their skills and helping to recognise their skills and showing that this benefits them in their studies and future careers? In particular, the skills that they're gaining in their wider employment. How can institutions work with them to bridge the gap and harness that? Thank you.
Okay, well, given what you've just said, Ashley, it might be just adding a little bit to what you've said. Is there anything else you'd like to add to that? And then I'll go to Stephen, and then I'll go to Amira.
Yeah, thanks, Alison, and thanks for the question, Jonathan. I think this is about relevance, I suppose, is how I would, categorize this. I mean, there will always be useful skills learned in employment by any student that finds themselves in a situation where that's both necessary and potentially also desirable. But I suppose the more relevant you can make that, the better. So can it be relevant to their course of study? Can it be relevant somewhat towards their career ambitions, and particularly where are their skills within that would be transferable and useful throughout various employment opportunities? I think it's a really great opportunity, isn't it, to identify that learning that's going on through work alongside their studies. So for me, the answer to optimize that would lie in ensuring the relevance of that as far as possible.
Thank you very much. Stephen, anything to add?
Thanks. Yeah, no, I absolutely. I think all curricular activities are incredibly helpful to students, whether it's part-time work, volunteering, clubs and society. There's a whole host of really useful activities that students do outside of their studies. And I think career services within universities are really good at being able to sort of sit down and help students to be able to articulate these things on their CVs and help to pull on the strengths of the things that they've done throughout their time at university to be able to help them then move on to the next step and get the job. So that's why I don't see reasonable amounts of part-time paid work as being problematic. It's when it becomes too much is when it becomes problematic. But thanks, Alison.
Yeah. So that question about what is too much, and we do have recommended guidelines, and you mentioned, earlier about the Scottish guidelines being overpassed. So that's an interesting thought for us. What is too much? And it ties into Mary's question, which will follow, I think. Amira, what about the student perspective on this?
And I think a lot of students do see the value of working alongside their studies. And I think a lot of people are gaining a variety of different skills, whether they're working in hospitality or for an organization in the sector that they want to enter after their study. As both the other panelists highlighted, there is already that role that university career services, et cetera, play in helping for that application. I think what I would caution at is, although those skills are being developed and learned, etc., there's also the element of truly understanding how students navigate when sometimes they are in exploitative work fields, and how we actually cater and support students to understand and recognize that and be able to deal with that piece, because that's also a skill that people need in order to carry through them in life.
Super. Thank you very much. Now, it's interesting in these conversations, a lot of votes come up for the Susan and Mary Kernock Cook questions. So I'm going to start with Stephen on this one, because it's a question for you, Steve. Others, if you have something to say, put your hand up and say you'd like to say something. But this is Susan, could you ask your question, please? Are you there,
Hi,
Susan?
yeah, I'm here. Sorry, thank you. Hi, my name's Susan Docherty, and I'm an early intervention specialist in the student success team at University of West of Scotland. And this is, obviously we're looking at different barriers, that we can sort of break down, to help students succeed. So you were talking about that you do work around adjusting timetables to help support working students. So do you have anything you can tell us a wee bit more about that?
Yeah, no, sure. No, thanks, Susan. And thanks. Great to meet somebody from our near neighbour on the other side of the city. Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, it's of course it's dead difficult, and we all every university that tries to do this, organising the timetable is probably the most complicated things any university does, because you're trying to optimize lots of different constraints simultaneously. So what we've decided to do is we've had a series of principles in our university timetabling, which we've agreed across the university as to which are going to be the most important things as we shape the timetable. And what we decided as a university is to try to make that as student-centered as we possibly could. And our students were particularly telling us that they needed blocks out of studying to be able to. It's much easier to access part-time work if you've got a day, or you've got an afternoon or a morning when you're not studying. So what we've tried to do, it's not perfect, but what we've tried to do is to organise our timetablings to try to not have all of the contact hours for a student sort of gradually dispersed over the entire week, from the beginning of Monday to the end of Friday, because that makes it, I think, more difficult for students to access part-time work. It's not perfect, and as you'll know, timetabling is the most incredibly complicated thing I think universities do. So ours isn't perfect, but that's what we've been trying to do, Sis.
Stephen, you've just sparked a question for me. And timetabling is difficult. Are you using AI to help with this at all? Because it seems to be an ideal candidate for AI.
I think we should do, yeah. So, like every university, we are now sort of thinking through how we embrace AI as a technology, and we've decided we are going to try our very best to embrace it and not be scared of it. So I'm sure there's ways to do it. We have that. That's not something we've done yet. And if others have done that, I'd be fascinated to know. But
okay, it seems an ideal bit of terrain to find the solution. So as this was specific for you, and we've got a lot of questions coming through now, I'm going to move on. And could Mary come online with her question, please? And this is something I expect all of the panel to have a view on. Thank you. Mary, over to you.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. Amongst other things, I'm a trustee at HEPI, and HEPI's actually published a lot of really good content about how unaffordable higher education is for students, not least that the maintenance grants very often don't even cover basic accommodation rentals in many universities and cities. So my question is about this idea that full-time study is, whether it's full-time or not. I personally think it's time we kind of ditched that idea. The model of X number of weeks of term time, X number of weeks of leave time has, goes back decades to a previous era when higher education was for the elite and a very small proportion of people accessed higher education. And now we've got to live with the new reality that students who want to access higher education and do so successfully and get some of the wider experience as well as the kind of transactional learning bit are needing to work to be able to afford that. And that might have some additional benefits as well as disbenefits. So my challenge is it time to really ditch the current model of full time and actually organize properly around the reality for students, which is that they're going to need to do some paid work alongside their studies. And, I heard what Stephen said about timetabling being difficult, but I really think it's time for the sector to challenge itself, start from bottom up and actually organize studies around the needs of students.
So I think the order I'd like to go in here, please. Ashley, you're the one with the experience here. Amira, you talk to us about models and, about how models are in our control, and then perhaps come to Stephen at the end. So Ashley, if you'd like to go first, and then Amira to follow, then Stephen. Thank you.
Thanks, Alison. Morning, Mary. Thanks for an intriguing and challenging and provocative question. I mean, in some respects, that you might expect me to answer the question with a straightforward yes. I'm not so sure, actually. I think what we absolutely do need, though, is we need to challenge some of the conventions, and we do need to challenge some of the traditional ways of approaching this. And then after that, what we will need is a variety, I think, and a greater diversity of offer within the sector. I think one of the challenges is too much of it looks like what you're describing as possibly needing ditching, I think was your language. But inside all of that, I think what institutions must do is look in detail at their pedagogy. Look at ways in which the design of their programs, the implementation of their pedagogy can better support flexibility, can be more in tune with students' needs within the confines of having to work or needing to work or wanting a more flexible offer. I think that means using better technology. I think, Mary, you were part of the same group I was during the pandemic about, the rush to use learning technologies in a world where students couldn't attend campus. And I'm not sure on reflection now that we've really learned enough from that period in using technology to support and provide hybrid and asynchronous and synchronous modes of learning that aren't necessarily about the traditional campus attendance. So I think better use of technology, better use of data for sure, better use of understanding student engagement at each point of that and how what you're doing is working is absolutely essential. And then, as I say, looking at ways that you can, Stephen, you said this in your earlier response, sizing this to the student, getting much more ambitious about saying what is right for our type of student and gearing your offer that way, whatever that looks like, Mary, whether it looks like what you've described or not. I think the time is right to really tune each institution's offer based on what they know about their students, what they need to get from their time at that institution and how to make it work best for both parties. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I like that sizing it for the student piece. Very good. Excellent. Amira, over to you.
I think I'm going to harp a similar message. It's not about ditching full-time study as a model, but it's about facilitating actual choice. And where we're at is it's clear that the full-time study model has its benefits and its flaws, right? Flaws that are being reflected then in things that we see in terms of the experience gap and the awarding gap, et cetera, right? Flaws that we see that this model doesn't work for everyone. But it also seems to me that many of the other options that we're exploring, so part-time study, adaptations within, you were talking about timetables, apprenticeships, et cetera, also offer both benefits and flaws for different types of students, right? And I also think that the imagined futures around higher education of how we deliver it will also have benefits and flaws. And so what we're really talking about is how do we serve as many people in our community as possible, right? And I cannot help but think that it's about facilitating choice. But facilitating choice is expensive for institutions as well, right? To deliver that plethora, that breadth of different ways that you can study, different ways that you can engage in different content, et cetera, et cetera. It takes time, it takes money, and it takes resource. And simultaneously, what we've also found with the idea of not making it possible for students to afford to be students, right? We're talking about a similar thing of the resource that students hold, the time that students hold, and how they prioritize and how they make decisions. And what I find deeply, deeply concerning, which is where I think the real conversation is at what point do we continue to squander the opportunity for choice for both institutions and students to a point where we do not have an accessible system? We do not have something. We're not actually building towards our higher education that is supposed to be more inclusive, that's supposed to be more diverse, that's supposed to be more accessible, right? So I think it's not about ditching full-time study, but it's about facilitating actual choice.
Thank you very much. Stephen, reflections on those comments and your own?
Thanks. Yeah, no, I agree with everything Ashley and Amir have just said. I'm really impressed by our students. Our students have a lot going on in their lives. There's a lot that they're incredibly. Our students are so remarkable. There's so many of our students are parents, carers, have really complex lives outside of university. Managing to do part-time work in addition to their studies. And I think on Ashley's point, I think it is about understanding our students and each university understanding their student needs and tailoring to what they're doing accordingly. I think for in terms of those universities which are in city ecosystems where there are multiple universities near to each other, I think it's easier to do that student choice that Amira talks about very eloquently through a collective approach through different universities. If I think about where I am sitting in the centre of Glasgow, I've got Strathclyde a few hundred metres one way. I've got the Glasgow School of Art in the opposite direction, also within walking distance. The University of Glasgow is a long walk from here, but it's still a walking distance. I've got the Royal Conservatoire, the City of Glasgow College also does higher education as well as further education. There's a whole ecosystem within our city where it enables student choice by the universities and the colleges collectively putting on something which provides the needs of our communities and the needs of our employers, which makes it easier to respond to the sorts of challenges that we're talking about and being able to be responsive to different students. I think it's harder in situations where there's not multiple universities sitting next to each other. But thanks, Alison.
Thank you very much. I'm going to put on notice now Johnny Rich and Mike Larkin. And Johnny, what I like about your question, it kind of picks up the other question, which is getting a lot of votes about Oxbridge and Cambridge and their statutes. So, and then the other question is an anonymous question, which is for Amira specifically, and I do believe you have the answer to this. So, whilst panel are thinking about Johnny and Mike's questions, this question is anonymous, but I'll read it out. It's about the statistics that you might have, which gives us insight into international students and employment while studying, such as percentage of international students who look to work part-time, etc. Do you have some stats there? I think you do, Amira, that you can share with us on that one.
Yeah, so April 2024, we did a bit of a study at NUS about international student experience in general. And one of the things we found from that, and I can probably share this with you if we can get in contact with you. But essentially, we saw that about 70% of international students are doing some kind of work alongside study. But what was particularly interesting about this study was that we found that almost 10% of international students were in full-time work alongside their studies. And so what you're talking about there is someone who's in full-time study and in full-time work at the same time, which I think we can all agree is it's not how the model is dealt to support. Obviously, is also not in line with what the UK have set for international students, obviously with the 20-hour working cap. And I think there's also some caution around that in terms of what people are willing to put in surveys, et cetera, about their actual working habits when they are restricted around visa regulations, et cetera. There's a really, really challenging story to tell around international student experience, how it's affected by work comparatively to our home students, the number of them on 0-hour contracts and less secure types of work as well. And yeah, there's lots and lots of studies around that not only are students' unions doing on a local level, but we also have at that sort of national picture level. And it's clear that it is a story of people working due to financial burden as opposed to people working to expand their experiences or expand their horizons in that sense. So yeah, there was lots of really good data around there.
Thank you very much, Amira. That's great. So, Johnny, over to you, please.
Thanks very much, Alison, and thanks everybody. Amira has already addressed my question quite directly to some extent, so I'll ask it in a slightly different way. On balance, is the shift towards paid work positive for access or negative for access? Is it making it affordable for more people, for a wider variety of people to gain a higher education because they can work alongside or have to work alongside, or is it exacerbating the access to high contact hour courses, institutions where either by availability of work or statute you're not able to do paid work, and of course the outcomes, differentials in outcomes, because some students have to work long hours whilst others get to spend their time in the library.
Okay, who wants to go for it? Oh, Amira, you're on screen. Go on. Go for it.
Yeah, and I mean, some of this has been touched. I know that Ashley's keen to come in as well. Yeah, I think there's a lot of nuance to it, of course. We do see most students working because they need the money, not necessarily working in industries or worlds that they necessarily aspire to be in. Granted, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not still gaining skills from the work that they're engaging in, right? The realities of how we see the awarded gap affected by this, the experience gaps affected by this are very, very real. And I mean, I think that sort of in the HE view of this, it's hard to not turn around and go, well, why wouldn't we put money in students' pockets so that they can study and truly then choose to take on work for the sake of that exploration of skill set, as opposed to taking on work because they feel they financially need to, right? Simultaneously, that when we see a higher proportion of people from working backgrounds, or a higher proportion of students working alongside their studies, but then we look at the actual access piece that we see in universities. I was at the Sutton Trust yesterday, and their study showed that although we've seen an expansion in people from working class backgrounds going into universities, if you actually look at how much we've closed the gap between the different proportions of different types of people, it's actually not as significant a change as we might have felt that we wanted to attain. And that's not to say that our institutions aren't working incredibly hard to make those changes, but that is also to say that the proportion of people having to work alongside their studies is not necessarily representative of an increase in the number of working class people going to universities proportionally. And so I think there's a really challenging field that we're experiencing where we need to facilitate choice, but then we also need to help people through the realities of what they're going to. We can't ignore that.
Thank you very much, Amira. Stephen, given your widening access mission, what are your thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I think widening access is a huge success of higher education in the UK. It's a huge success in Scotland. We've got a larger number of students from widening access backgrounds coming into universities, and the universities are increasingly able to support those students to be able to go on to do what they want to do with the rest of their lives. So we've got, as I said in my talk, we've got the largest number of students from widening access backgrounds in Scotland. That's growing. The metrics for those students are really good. They go on to get the jobs that they want, and we play a crucial role within our city. We tend to recruit students from Glasgow. Our students tend to stay in Glasgow and have graduate level work after they've left us. Part-time work in addition to their study, I think is a function of increasing challenges with cost of living in the UK. We need to do our best to support our students in lots of different ways. I think it's remarkable for our students that those financial pressures on those students from cost of living crises aren't causing a huge drop in working access students. And I think the way that the universities have managed to respond to that, I think is fantastic. But we mustn't be complacent. We need to keep working hard on that. But thanks, Johnny, for the question.
Thank you very much, Steve. So I'm going to move on to Mike Larkin's question now, and I'm going to ask Ashley and Amira to respond to his question. Thank you. Are you there, Mike?
Yes, sorry, it
Good.
came up in the corner. I needed to unmute myself, something that doesn't happen very often. Yeah, this is a great discussion, and I think there's not a huge amount of consensus in the end, and that the solutions vary. So what I'm stating, and it's in a blog I wrote a few days ago, it's commonplace for students to be in work during term time, and that's been going on for many years. And I've tracked that back to the 1990s, and there's data to back that up. So in the end, it's a two-tier experience for many students, setting aside apprenticeships and other work experience. For most students who work, it's a two-tier system. So the question to everybody is, should we accept this at all? And for Amira, at what point do you think the students, and lovely to see you again, Amira, at what point should the students organise and reject fee rises and the level of support that they're getting? Is there any sort of push on that?
So Ashley, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I'm happy to. Thanks, Mike. Great question. If I may, I'm going to pick up on a few themes that have come out of this, because I think you are right, Mike. I don't think there is consensus. I also don't think it is a two-tier system. It may be a two-tier experience within a full-time campus-based study model for those that are forced to work or find work a necessity versus those that don't. I think that is a two-tier experience. My honest feeling is that we need to embrace the notion of a whole series of different experiences at university. And actually what we must do is shift it from that notion of it being a necessity to be in work and it being much more of a choice. And I think that's incumbent upon institutions to understand what their model is, understand who it is right for and perhaps who it is not right for in terms of their student body, and be honest about that at the outset and be clear about what the expectations are, whether it's feasible or not, to be able to work alongside study and contrive the offer accordingly. I think at the moment what we've got is some, blurring of that, which doesn't always make it clear. And I would just emphasize, I think this is really compounded, and this is a bit back to Johnny's question, by the way. And Johnny, quick question to you, what level playing fields? But anyway, the real issue here is, whilst we've got the backdrop, and this is slightly ironic, of the financial challenges of the sector, how do institutions really present an honest view of their offer when half the time they're scrabbling through clearing to get as many students as possible into their model just to meet their financial requirements? We've heard of Russell Group institutions accepting 3 E's through clearing. Well, that tells you what you need to know about the race for students and the race to the bottom, if you like, as a result of that. So that's an unhelpful headwind in institutions trying to be much more agile and articulate in what their offer is to the right students, so students can really make a fully informed choice about what model they want and which part of the sector they want to find the best home for their own study and their own ambitions within. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Ashley. So, Amira, a general and then a specific point for you to think about and comment on. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I want to echo a lot of the things that Ashley said and probably just get into the second half of the question, because I think it's probably the more pressing bit. And I would push and say that students are organising already. The students are pushing for increased maintenance support. They want the reintroduction of maintenance grants and for maintenance loans to go up. They are pushing to see rent controls. I mean, literally 2 months ago, student leaders met with over 74 MPs to talk about not wanting to see their money thrown into guarantor schemes just because they are either from a working class family or a migrant or estranged or caregivers and care leavers. You know, students are on media all the time talking about the challenges that they are facing. This is a narrative that so many people in the British public are aware of because students, as well as our institutions, as well as our staff, are talking about it, right? Students are organizing, they are pushing, they do want to see change, right? They are trying to build power. We are trying to engage with these different things. And so I think it's not that students aren't rejecting or saying that they are upset at this model and that they want their change, but students are also in very immediate challenges, facing very immediate challenges where they need money in their pockets right now, right? We're talking about students who are sometimes at risk when it comes to housing security, financial, like all of these different challenges that people are facing. They also need the bursaries and the hardship funds. They need the immediate responses. They need the changes to their timetables. They need the things that can facilitate them getting their education now. And so I think it's not that the rejection for these different things and the rejection for poor support has not been deeply expressed or pushed for. It's simply that these are hard things to push for, and the work is going to continue to be done, right?
Thanks very much. So what I'd like to do now is to move on. We got an interesting question from Joe Johnson with a regulatory twist, no surprises there. And then Emily Timpson's had quite a lot of votes as well. You also mentioned the B3 regulations, but a broader canvas, Emily. So Joe, would you like to start off with your question, please? And then we'll come on to Emily. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks very much. Great panel discussion. Much enjoying it. And really it builds, I guess, on Mary's point that we need to reimagine full-time versus part-time. I think the centerpiece of the OFS B3 metrics is the non-continuation metric. And with the advent of the LLE, that metric it needs to be reimagined almost entirely. But I wondered, in relation to this discussion, to what extent the panel felt that it was becoming less credible as a means of holding institutions to account because of the financial pressures that have nothing to do with teaching or the quality of education at an institution that might force students to drop out of their studies and become and to figure in that B3 metric. So to what extent is the B3 metric losing its validity?
Thank you, Joe. Great question. So Stephen, Ashley, and then Amira.
Yeah, thanks. It's difficult to comment on OFS regulations from a Scottish viewpoint because we have an entirely different regulatory system. I'm up here, but I think I think universities do work really hard on retention and continuation, and that is really important that students come into universities and are confident that they'll be able to progress through their studies. And so I think having a metrics-based approach to informing the regulation of universities, I think is appropriate, and our continuation and our retention is strong. The way that the balance I think in England has become rather sort of metrics informed, being sort of almost completely dominant. I think is something for the English sector to think about. But I don't think there's anything wrong with wanting continuation and retention to be really important metrics, because I think students would want to come into a degree with confidence that they can succeed and they're going into a course that there's a track record of universities supporting their students to success.
Thanks very much, Stephen. A bit unfair, but you have worked in England, I know.
I have.
I've seen your CV. Thank you very much, Ashley.
Yeah, thanks, Alison. Great question, Joe. And actually, I think it's sort of slightly wider than that. I think probably it calls into question a number of metrics across conditions of registration and the way universities are measured, because unfortunately, in this instance, one size doesn't fit all, and yet we have one size. So I think what we would really look for is a nuanced version of a number of metrics, whether it's outcomes, whether it's continuation rates, whether it's access and participation, right across the regulatory piece, and really get clear on what is necessary and right, perhaps dependent upon the type of provision, because certainly my institution finds it incredibly difficult to fit within all of those somewhat rigid metrics that we have. What I do think it leads to, and this is an unfortunate consequence of all of this, is a lack of innovation. The comment's already been made by Johnny, I think, that, as we look towards the LLE model, we will need hop-on, hop-off models. We will need, students to be able to flex through multiple institutions, to use credit transfer frameworks and all of that stuff we've discussed actually in these sessions before that isn't there today. So the challenge in innovating the sector is making sure that the regulatory compliance piece comes along at the same rate and doesn't accidentally stifle some of that innovation because institutions feel unwilling to venture into areas that are innovative but don't conform with the regulatory compliance that's put upon them. Thanks.
Thank you. Amira, is there anything you'd like to say? Don't feel pressed if it's not something on your agenda.
I do think there's something really interesting about how, like, quality of teaching should have nothing to do with the cost of living, right? And the lack of support that students are facing, partially obviously from the government, has meant that universities have been, in some sense, required and expected to take up this role of providing financially for students, right? At the same time as trying to provide higher quality teaching, on what we're seeing becoming on a budget that's getting ever smaller and smaller, right? And so those challenges are not amiss. That's not to say that the metric isn't still useful, but that is to say that we've got a lot of difficult tasks, in some senses, near impossible tasks for some universities, to support their students on less money, who are facing those real challenges, right? And that issue is bigger than that metric, right? And it's one that we're all aware of and actively trying to do work around.
Hello, Emily. Amira, have you finished? Sorry, I lost my Wi-Fi connection. I thought I might, but it seems like we've coordinated very well. So thank you for that. Emily, would you like to ask your question, please? Some of it may have already been touched upon, you feel, but there are some other interesting points within your question which you might like to draw out.
Lovely. Thank you, Alison. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you. So yeah, my question was around short integrated placement modules that seem to be really suffering at the moment. This is something that we have at my university. It's a core part of our degree program. Students do short placements embedded kind of within the curriculum, but students are struggling to balance the study, working part-time and gaining that professional experience, which means more and more students are actually ending up doing alternative assessments, essays. They're not going out there and gaining that experience. And we know that there's opportunities such as sandwiches which don't work for everybody. So it's really thinking about what other work-based learning opportunities can universities explore when doing it within the curriculum is increasingly challenging. The longer periods of work experience aren't necessarily appealing to everybody, and whilst part-time experience to support students, it often isn't graduate level experiences that organisations are looking for. And with the B3 graduate outcomes conditions and measurements that we have, how can we ensure our students are gaining that professional experience alongside their studies while supporting students to get that essential paid work that we know that they need to even engage with their studies, let alone any experiential learning.
Thank you very much, Emily. I know you're in a very difficult position, Ashley, with your students, but are there any learning points that we can take from your experience? Amira, what do students want? And then Stephen, from your experience about, what you do at GCU. So Ashley, why don't you start us off? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Alice. I feel a bit awkward and slightly embarrassed in trying to answer the question when this is something that, is a bit innate to it. But I think it's relevant, Emily. And I suppose the advice I would give is this is about that three-way relationship, isn't it, between students, institutions, and employers and industry. And I think that's key. And so, the way we solve this, and of course we're lucky in that we have a single industry to focus on, but of course that continues to include many fragmented and many diverse component parts, is we focus very heavily on that industry and employer engagement. And whilst that may not represent all the answer to your question, I think it's a great start point, is to really engage your relevant, either regional or local or relevant industries based on your curriculum, and really look at ways that you can bring them in early into that curriculum development and design, and involve them so that they are much more vested partners in that than they are simply opportunities for industry placements as you go on. Now, you probably already do that, so it probably feels like a rather inadequate answer. But for me, this is about long-term, persistent, and by design engagement with employers at every step of the way.
Thank you very much, Ashley. Amira, what do students want on this issue?
We're talking about placement models, right? Just
well,
to clarify.
the worry about that there just isn't sufficient of that happening nowadays. I mean, it does tie a bit into a question, an anonymous question about we're looking very in towards HE and not enough at the employer at the moment. But it's quite a long question, and I'd like to get people speaking. So yeah, in terms of, I mean, what's it like? Is it something that you're worried about? That placement models are really suffering, inability to study, work part-time, gain professional work experience, etc. Work-based learning opportunities. What can be better? How can we improve that? With a real worry that the B3 graduate outcome metric is likely to suffer because of the lack of this. Is it something that students are worried about, experiencing, feeling?
Well, I think a lot of our students who are already on placements, right? So largely a lot of our teaching and healthcare students, obviously on placements where they aren't remunerated for the work that they are doing, which is obviously really challenging for many of them because of the cost of actually going to placement, participating in that study, etc., etc. And so we're in a place where I think students' relationship with placement is a difficult one because of the challenges that they're facing in those spaces, and obviously the high intensity nature of a lot of the placement environments. Granted, we also have a lot of students really gaining from placement experience, particularly because placements are so designed as to the careers and the worlds that they are going to enter. And so I'm not sure that there's a very good answer to that question in terms of what students.
No, I think it is, because you're just saying how crucial it absolutely is. And so Emily's right to be worried about it if they're struggling. So I wonder if Stephen can offer any tips on this from your experience.
I agree. I agree. It is crucial. That it is part of our education strategy to build more and more placements as an integrated part of our degree programs. It's something we are expanding, and I think our own strong graduate employability is largely because we're putting more and more placements into our degree programs. And it's essential. And it's hard work for us. It's not straightforward to find placements. One of our biggest challenges is within the health service. We've got that, of course, that challenge that the health service wants more employees. We want to recruit more students to take those places, but often a limiting factor is the availability of placements, because often the NHS is quite stretched. So to be able to provide placements is an overhead.
You're saying it is difficult, as Emily's pointed out. Yeah,
sure. Absolutely. And that's something we, particularly in the health service, we have to work really hard to be able to get enough placements. And we're managing to do it, but it's a continuous.
So I think what we can say, this is a challenge, Emily, for everybody, but it's incredibly important. And I'm conscious we've got 1 minute left now. There's a great question, and the panelists, you have no time to answer this question, so it's one sentence. What work did you, as a panelist, do alongside your studies, and did it benefit or disadvantage you? So I want you to say, I did or I didn't. I did X or I didn't do anything, and it either did or didn't benefit me. That's short and sharp, but just is like interested. So Stephen, you've got the mic. Did you do any studies? What did you do? And did it benefit or disadvantage you?
Yeah, I was an undergraduate at Brunel, and I did 3 work placements as part of my undergraduate degree, and it greatly helped me. It was a great experience.
But you didn't do paid work.
I didn't do paid work because I did 3 work placements as part.
Super. All right, thank you. Ashley.
I did undergraduate economics at the University of London at Royal Holloway. I didn't do any placements, but I did do paid work in the local pub, which benefited me not in the slightest.
Thank you very much. And what about you, Amira?
I taught violin. I worked at the Birmingham Royal Ballet. I worked at a beer garden in Birmingham, and I was a Black Voices community organizer, so I worked in student democracy as well. All 4 of those were paid, and I would say that probably 2.5 out of those were really beneficial to me.
Great, thank you very much. Can we just thank the panel hugely for a fantastic discussion, commentary, fantastic questions from our audience today. I'm sorry we didn't get through all of them, but it's been a really stimulating discussion. And I'm just going to hand over to Nick to say 2 or 3 words as we close. And I'm wishing you all a great 2025. Thank you very much. Over to you, Nick.
Well, thank you, Alison. And just to reinforce our thanks from HEPI to all the contributors, both the speakers and the questioners, and indeed to you as well, Alison. I'm intrigued to know what job you did at university as well, but it probably isn't time to go into that. So I'll just plug, if this has whetted people's appetites, we've actually got an all-day event at Birkbeck on Thursday, details on our website with the title "Who Pays? Exploring Fairer Funding Models for Higher Education." So look at our website if you're interested in coming along to that. And of course, this is the first of a series of 3 events. We've got 2 other events with Alison and her colleagues coming up, one in February on EDI and one in March on operating models for higher education. So look out for those. But and of course, we are already out in the field with the 2025 Student Academic Experience Survey. So these conversations will be continuing later in the year when we get the data from that, which is again a joint project between HEPI and Advance HE. So I'm going to call it to a halt there. Thank you so much, Alison. Thank you, everybody, and look forward to continuing these conversations throughout the year.
And thanks to Emma, who makes it all happen in the background. Thank you very much, everybody. Bye bye.